Pong kicked off the arcade scene in the early 70s, the Odyssey kicked off the commercialization of games, and in 1978, Japanese company Taito began the golden age of arcade games with the beloved title, Space Invaders. There was a period of stagnation in the late 70s following the success of Pong, and the subsequent paddle game trend followed. Lots of arcade games tried to mimic Pong's success by creating games that were really similar or utilized similar mechanics. Space Invaders was the first game to step away from this trend, developed by a man named Tomohiro Nishikado. Nishikado joined the Japanese company Taito in 1968 and began by working on electromechanical games, which we discussed in my previous episode. In 1972, Nishikado began working on video game development, and he actually spent 6 months dissecting Atari's Pong arcade unit to learn more about how the game's integrated circuits worked. Afterwards, he began modifying the game, and later he would develop and help publish a little over 10 paddle games before branching out to create his own unique mechanics. Even though Space Invaders would be released under a publisher, I like to consider Nishikado to be one of the first people to become an indie developer. Not only is it rumored that he created a microcomputer from scratch to make the game, but he also is the sole programmer, designer, artist, hardware engineer, and composer of Space Invaders. As one of the first ever shooter games, Space Invaders also set the standard for shooter game mechanics, such as taking cover from enemy fire and the use of destructible barriers. But what is important about Space Invaders was how it brought about the standardization of giving players more than one life per credit, as well as the concept of saving the highest score to the machine. Now, if extra lives and high scores couldn't convince you, don't even get me started on the fact that Shigeru Miyamoto, yes, the guy who made Zelda, Mario, and future arcade hit Donkey Kong, was asked the question, what one game has revolutionized the industry? And he responds with, and I quote from this Times article, Space Invaders. Before I saw it, I was never particularly interested in video games, and I certainly never thought I would make video games. I'm not even going to try to convince you any further about how important this game was to the industry, because if that didn't convince you, literally nothing will. So moving on into the actual golden age, I could talk about all the well-known games of the time. I could get into Pac-Man, Asteroids, Galaxian, Frogger, and Donkey Kong, but I'm not. Instead, I'd like to highlight a couple of the forgotten favorites that really define this golden age of arcade games and likely inspired pretty much all the trends we see in games coming out later on in history. The first game that really caught my eye while I was researching is called Zaxxon. Now, Zaxxon was released in 1982 by Sega and was the first isometric shooter game ever. The objective of the game is to destroy as many enemies as possible without being shot down or running out of fuel. And don't worry, if you started running low, you were allowed to replenish it by blowing up fuel drums. Now, the fun thing about this game too was the fact that the aircraft couldn't move forward or backward, it just flies at a constant speed, and this sort of control and movement really wasn't common in arcade games at the time. So all the arcade cabinets actually had to have illustrations around the joystick to indicate the effect of each position on the aircraft. Not only was this the first isometric game, but it was the first arcade game ever to be advertised on TV with an ad that was worth $150,000. Can you just imagine? It's freaking 1982. Video games weren't even a thing like 10 years ago, and all of a sudden, you're seeing ads for them on the TV. Like, I can't imagine. I remember having my mind blown just by seeing like ads for Halo on TV, because in my house, video games were really common, but I felt like they weren't in other houses until like the Wii came out. So it just is crazy to me that back in the 80s, there was an ad that ran for an arcade game, a game that you literally had to leave the house to go play. The second game I want to highlight is called Berserk, and it was designed by Alan McNeil in 1980 and released for arcades through Stern Electronics of Chicago. The game places the player in a bunch of top-down maze-like rooms containing armed robots, and following in the path of the lesser-known game Stratovox, which was published by Taito, Berserk is the second arcade game ever to feature speech synthesis with game events. For example, intruder alert is spoken when Evil Otto appears. Now, Evil Otto is like this freaky little indestructible smiley face that would hunt you down if you like weren't killing the robots fast enough. That thought is horrifying.
The humanoid must not escape.
is heard when the player escapes a room after destroying every robot. Not to mention, throughout the game, there's lots of random robot chatter playing in the background as well. Now, last but not least, I'd like to talk about Rally X, and while it gets mentioned a lot when we are talking about Golden Age arcade games, I feel like there's just enough interesting things about this game to highlight it. So Rally X is a maze chase game where the player controls a blue Formula One race car. The objective is to collect yellow flags that are kind of scattered around this maze map while you're trying to dodge the red cars that are hunting you down. What I found really interesting about this game was that it was developed between two countries, Japan and Germany, through the Namco company. The game is also credited as being one of the first games to feature continuous background music and a bonus round at the end of the game. Think of it like a 2D Mario Kart, except less fun. Now, of course, in the words of my favorite artist's newest song, all things end. This wonderful golden age of game development and arcade releases kind of had to come to some sort of halt, and unfortunately, it was a pretty dramatic one.
Boston has become the victim of an electronic blight. With fewer than 600,000 people, the city has 4,000 to 5,000 video games, not just in arcades, but also in drugstores, pizza parlors, supermarkets.
In some sections of the city, we have a machine or two machines and sometimes three machines in virtually every single corner store in a neighborhood.
City officials today announced that video games no longer will be licensed in residential areas, only in commercial and industrial neighborhoods. Officials say they are responding to complaints from parents that children have skipped school or stolen money to play the games and made a nuisance of themselves.
Senior citizens have rights. They have rights to go into the laundromat and wash their laundry in peace. They don't have to go by 2 or 3 machines or kids congregating and passing fast remarks as they walk in and terrorizing them in some instances.
Not only did arcades require constant development and rotation of new games, there was also a fairly large amount of them relative to the market of people who actually played arcade games. Alongside this, many adults began to stress about the impact of games on teens and kids. In March of 1981, 100 people demonstrated at an arcade in Franklin, New York, telling the New York Times that since it had opened, there was a rise in crime, vandalism, and drug abuse, despite the lack of actual evidence that any of this was true. Across the country, more protests would follow, and in November of 1982, it all fell apart. The U.S. Surgeon General of the time, C. Everett Koop, gave a speech in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania about the potential addiction of video games in young children. By February of 1983, psychologists were posting that the intensity of the experience of video games was too worrisome. Unfortunately, this had a big impact on not only arcade games, but just places that teens or youth generally gathered, so places such as roller rinks, ice skating rinks, malls, that sort of thing. Well, it is a bit of a sad note to end on. If you want to hear more about the booming business of home consoles, be sure to keep an eye out for my video next week, where I will discuss all the consoles that rolls alongside these marvelous arcade games. I also want to take a moment to thank you for liking, viewing, and hopefully subscribing after you watch this video. I recently hit 51 subscribers on YouTube, and while that seems like a silly thing to be excited about, I honestly am just proud of myself for making it to 50 subscribers in the first place and just posting this consistently on YouTube. I've tried and frankly failed a lot to consistently post on any kind of social media, and the fact I'm really enjoying what I'm doing right now and seeing other people enjoy it really means a lot to me. So if you're not subscribed already, please consider it, and if you liked the video, be sure to leave it a like down below. As always, it's been nice talking to you, and I'm Purple Sahar, and I'm logging off.